And welcome to another lecture. Thank you guys so much for joining me each week. I know this is not easy, but thank you for being there. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started with our next lecture on marine plants and algae. Alright, so remember, just like before, we are in the domain Eukarya. Remember the bacteria are like the prokaryotes, right? Things like cyanobacteria, oscillatoria, all that kind of stuff. But when we're talking about eukaryotes, that's everything else. That's funguses, that's plants, that's animals, that's protists, that's all sorts of different stuff. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So in the domain Eukarya are a bunch of kingdoms. We already talked about this, right? We were down here in the domain, the kingdom Protista, right? Those are those little tiny organisms that we talked about last week in our microbes lecture. Now we're in the kingdom Plantae. Okay, we're going to be getting very, very soon to the kingdom Animalia, and we briefly touch up on the kingdom Fungi, but really we're going to be focusing just on the kingdom Plantae today. So remember, taxonomy is really important. You need to know that you are in the domain Eukarya. You need to know that you are now in the kingdom Plantae. All these things are really, really important to know for things like your practical, okay? So keep that in mind as we go along today. All right. So let's talk about primary producers, right? Hopefully you guys remember what primary producers are. These are the ones that are doing the photosynthesis. Remember when we talked about those trophic structures, right? Everything on the bottom layer, that was in ecology. Everything on that bottom layer, that is primary producers. And they are super important, right? They're giving us those usable energy, right? They're taking that sun energy that's coming down, they absorb it, they turn it into sugar energy and usable nutrient energy, and that's exactly what we obtain. So all of our energy is going to be coming from these primary producers. So, which shouldn't shock you, these marine plants are primary producers, but so are algae, okay? And I do say plants and algae because, again, they are two very separate things. Now, typically when we're talking about algae, people usually refer to them as seaweeds, right? That's seaweeds. And there is no real seaweed. There's eelgrass and there's kelp and there's all sorts of different types of algae, but usually everyone just says, oh, there's seaweed. So we are going to be learning about a couple specific ones, but I'm going to let you guys know on which specific ones that we're really going to be focusing on, and therefore you will need to know them. Typically what we call them are not seaweeds, but macroalgae. Not microalgae, but macroalgae, which is really, really big, and therefore, you can see it with your naked eye, hence macro or larger. Let's see. They are thought to be the ancestor of true plants. Now that is pretty cool. So we all learned that, you learned in this class, that life started in the ocean, right? A life on this planet started in the ocean. Or aliens. No, I'm kidding. I do believe in aliens, but I don't think that they, dropped us off here or anything like that. But anyway, I digress. Okay, so we're talking about the life starting in the ocean, right? All life started in the ocean, and that includes plant life. Now, there were algae before there were actual plants, land plants. So before plants actually made that transition onto land from being in the ocean, we had algae. We had lots of algae in the ocean. So eventually, some of those algae were able to colonize and settle closer to the shore. So it was kind of like little by little. It was almost them crawling up on shore or walking out, but they don't have legs, so they do it the way plants do. They grow. Okay, so they grew out of the ocean and closer to the surface, to the shore, survived on the shore, and this is, you can actually see to this day in the intertidal zone. If you go to any kind of tide pooling, anything like that, like a beach, if you look up on the highest part, you'll probably see a little bit of green algae. And again, that's going to be covered only by, say, the high tides and exposed the rest of the time. But those are still types of algae that were able to survive where no other algae was. And remember, competition is a big deal. So if you're able to survive in an area that nobody else can, you're probably going to do pretty well. Okay, so that's exactly what we think happened with this green algae. Again, they started growing closer and closer up to shore. Where was I going? I was going this way, closer and closer up to shore, right? Trying to get onto the land, and then, and they were able to survive, with very little seawater, and then eventually without seawater. Okay, so then they actually were able to colonize land, and that's why we believe that green algae, one of the types of algae we're going to learn about today, was the ancestor of true plants, which is pretty cool. Even though plants came from algae, they're inherently different. So when we're talking about algae, we're talking specifically green algae was the ancestor of land plants, but there's different types of algae. Now, algae and plants are a little bit different in their structure. They have very similar structures, but they don't function exactly the same way, and therefore we do classify them as plants and algae. So we are going to look about that in just a second. I don't want to get ahead of myself because I have pictures to show you guys. But let's talk about the entire body of the algae. So we're going to focus on algae first because algae are more abundant in the ocean than plants. I mean, biomass-wise, there's diversity-wise for sure, there's way more algae than marine plants. And I think even biodiversity, the algae have it, especially when you're talking about the phytoplankton algae. Those are just abundant. Anyway, so let's talk about the body of algae. The entire body itself is called a thallus. Okay, so if I show you a picture and I say, what is this whole thing right here, you tell me it's a thallus. Okay? Now, if you're looking at something comparable to like the leaves, right, on a tree, those would be known as blades in algae. So the leaves in a tree do photosynthesis, but the blades of the algae do photosynthesis. Now, instead of actually having like a tree trunk, we would have what's called a stipe. This is essentially just used for 3D structure. It's what they grow off of. It's kind of like that main center part, like the trunk of a tree, but functionally way different. It doesn't have the whole xylem and phloem and all that stuff. It does have a holdfast instead of roots. So at the bottom of the plant, you have the roots that kind of bury into the soil, right? These aren't the same way. They don't dig inside the soil. They actually hold on to things like rocks. So the holdfast literally holds fast to the rocks. So you really, a lot of the times, you will not have algae unless you have some kind of hard structure. And that's because these roots are not good for the digging into the soil, right? They're only good for the holding on of something, hence hold fast. They also don't do any kind of nutrient absorption. So roots can absorb nutrients and stuff like that. These guys cannot. So again, just a holdfast, not a root. Now here's something that plants definitely don't have because they don't need it, because usually they're land plants and therefore living on land where there is gravity. Okay, but marine plants don't really have that problem. So algae have developed this really amazing marine plants. Marine algae, some of them, especially the brown algae, the Phaeophytus, these guys have what's called a pneumatocyst. And this is a pneumatocyst pronounced with an N but spelled with a PN. So the P is silent, but this is a pneumatocyst. So it's not a pneumatocyst, it's just a pneumatocyst right here. Now these pneumatocysts are actually filled with gases, usually the off gases of the plant. So they're the algae. I'm going to keep doing this, but again, it's such a distinction. They're very different, even though they function almost identically. Okay, so these pneumatocysts are usually off gases that the algae has produced via like photosynthesis. Sometimes some leftover CO2, but most likely just oxygen that's actually filled up this little tiny bladder. So pneumatocyst is known as a gas bladder. Bladder meaning something that it holds, and gas obviously, because we're talking about oxygen. So as these things do photosynthesis, they produce oxygen, which they don't need. So they actually store some of this in these little pneumatocysts, so they're gas bladders. Now this is really helpful if you're super heavy, but you need sunlight that's way up by the surface. So if you actually put a gas bladder on the base of each one of your blades, then it's actually going to be able to support and lift up the blades towards the sunlight where you can do photosynthesis. So very important to actually be able to get to that sunlight, especially because we learned about how much light gets absorbed in the water. So you want to make sure that you get all of that light. So you need to grow, and float towards the surface. And this is something that brown algae are really good at. So anytime you see a very well-defined gas bladder, or pneumatocyst, you'll probably be a brown algae. Hint, hint. All right, so let's look at a very classic brown algae. This is Macrocystus right here. This is the common giant kelp that we have off our coast. The really long, tall giant kelp that can get, 60, 70 feet long. Super long, if not longer, actually. And they grow really fast, like 1 to 2 feet a day. Every single day, these things are growing like a foot. And that's really important because they are so long, they tend to break off. And therefore, if you need to do photosynthesis, you need all of your blades, and therefore you can't break off, so you need to keep growing to replenish yourself. Not to mention, competition between these things are insane. Imagine if you have a dense kelp forest and everything's kind of living together, and everything's trying to shoot up as fast as it can to get that sunlight. Because what happens is we actually build this canopy right here. Now, this is giant kelp, and we're going to see this a lot over the semester, so this is one of the species I want you to know. This is Macrocystus porifera, okay? Giant kelp. Now, this is one of our most abundant ecosystems off of our California coast, and here's why. There are so many little habitats that you can survive in this one stalk of kelp. So remember what I talked about complexity, having those niches so that everything can live? right? It's not flat like this, it's complex like this. Well, look how complex this is. We've got the canopy that you could live under. We've got this long, tall, vertical stipe that you could live under. You've got all these blades that you could actually tuck yourself in between or live on. You've got this stipe again down here, which turns into a holdfast. All of these tiny little grasping little, basically like this, it kind of looks like spaghetti, that you can live in between. There's a ton of worms and small invertebrates that live in here. And then you've got many different species of fish that will actually utilize this in different ways. So remember, this is complexity or rugosity, super important when it comes to this kelp. And so therefore, very abundant and healthy ecosystems when there. All right, now let's talk about the parts, because yes, you will need to know this. And yes, this will be on your test. Now, we saw the holdfast down here. Right? Remember this long, tall, stalk-like part that is known as the stipe. We have the blades, which are like the leaves. And finally, we have the little pneumatocyst. Now, if you see that pneumatocyst, it's probably going to be a brown algae, so make sure to keep that in mind. All right, so let's move on. Oh, and then the whole body is known as the thallus. So the entire thing from start to finish is the thallus. Okay, let's talk about reproduction. And you're thinking, okay, it's algae, like plants, like how complicated is it really? It's actually way more complicated than us. They go through the same thing that plants go through, which is known as alternation of generations. Now, this alternation of generations essentially means, depending on your generation, you're either going to be one version or the other. Now, I'm not going to get too crazy into detail with this because, in my experience, it's conceptually kind of hard, and this isn't a plant class. This is just something that we go through. So we're not going to really dive into super detail on anybody's reproduction. We're just going to kind of scratch the surface. So that's what I'm going to go through with you guys today. Now, there are a couple different parts we need to learn about because we're talking about these different, right, alternating versions of themselves. So let's get a little vocab words clear. And yes, anything vocab word, anything that's underlined could very easily be on your test. Keep that in mind. Now, we have what's called a gametophyte. So this gametophyte right here are essentially like gametes. So gametes are sperm and eggs. So this is kind of like your sexual form of reproduction. So when you're in the gametophyte stage, you're what's known as haploid, or you only have half the number of chromosomes that you should have. Now, this is important because what you're going to want is another algae to come together that you actually form the full complete adult with a complete set of chromosomes known as the sporophyte. Okay, so if you have two gametes and you actually get fertilization to happen, the first step is what you get is a zygote. Essentially, it's the same thing as us being a zygote. This is a fertilized egg when it breaks down to it. Okay, that fertilized egg will eventually develop into us, or in this case, an algae, a sporophyte. Okay, so we're going to alternate between the gametophyte stage and the sporophyte stage. Now, this doesn't all happen at once. I mean, this is an alternation of generations. So this is happening generation over generation after generation. The plants aren't just switching from one to the other to the one to the other, because that's just not possible. All right, so let's look at this again. Okay, so the sporophyte has a complete copy of the DNA, right? They're diploid, hence the 2N. Okay, then what they're going to do is they're going to go through meiosis, or the sexual form of cell replication, and they're going to form these gametophytes. And these gametophytes, again, are just like gametes, just like sperm and eggs. They're going to come together, the sperm and the egg are going to come together, and they're going to form that zygote, that little fertilized egg, and that's going to develop back into the sporophyte. So in one generation, you're a sporophyte, the next you have gametophyte babies, which turn back into sporophytes, which then turn back into gametophytes, and that is that alternation of generation one to the next, to the next, to the next. Now, not all algae do this exactly the same. Some of them have separate sexes. Like we're going to see some of the green algae like sea lettuce, some of the brown algae like kelp, some of the red algae, they all have separate sexes. So there's a male version and a female version of the algae. And that's what's producing, retrospective gametes. And then they got together to form the zygote. Okay, some of them basically, like the rockweeds here, and a lot of the green algae, are going to actually have a dominant stage, meaning you're either going to be dominant as this diploid stage, that sporophyte, or you're going to be dominant in the haploid phase, or that gametophyte. So again, I'm not going to test you guys on which one is which, but I do want you guys to know that yes, they can be organisms, algae that are mostly sporophytes, and there are some algae that are mostly gametophytes, and there are other algae that are, both. Okay, they're male and female algae. I know. All right, let's keep going and talk about reproduction, because this is not the only way algae do it, right? Algae can actually do it in several different ways. One of them is called vegetative growth, and you can kind of think of this as like literally like a plant growing. That's vegetative growth. It starts one and then it kind of vegetates out. That's really kind of what's going on here. Once they actually do this, as they grow, they're going to start reproducing. When they reproduce, this is asexual. So essentially, you're just growing little clones of yourself, and then you're going to send off those little clones of yourself. So this is asexual. Again, this is going to be a genetic copy of the parent. Let's talk about marine algae uses, because most people are like, all right, great, photosynthesis, primary producers, okay, but why do I really care about algae? Well, you should really care about algae because chances are you had some algae today. Yeah, chances are really good that you had some algae today. I mean, that is if you brush your teeth. What? Yes, there is algae in your toothpaste. In fact, there are algae in a lot of your product. Algae is used as a thickening agent. So when companies are trying to like boost up the amount of product that they have, and they don't want to add any more expensive ingredients, they usually add a bunch of algae, and then all of a sudden you got a ton of extra product for very, very cheap. And, you know, pretty good for you too. Algae is actually really good for you. They have all sorts of different pills and stuff, algae pills that you can take to, you know, boost your immune system and all that good stuff, because algae is a really good thing. So let's talk about what algae, and specifically what kinds of algae, are super useful to us. So algin is an amazing little extract that basically is used as kind of like an emulsifier. So think about like cheese and stuff like that. So algin is one of the, an ice cream, oh my god. So that's exactly what gives it that plump ice cream. And you're like, wait, ice cream? Yes, it's not just milk and sugar. It's literally algin as well. So it kind of gives it that nice thickening agent. Carrageenan is a good one. That's actually used in our toothpaste. So that is a type of red algae that is used in our toothpaste. So if you brush your teeth this morning, which I really hope that you did, you ate some carrageenan. Yay! All right. Agar is another one. If you've ever worked in a science lab, and I'm so sorry we didn't get to do this, we would have actually worked with agar. But it's kind of like Jell-O, like a little thicker than Jell-O, but same kind of wiggle, same kind of. Works as a really great fake membrane. Works as like growth plates in petri dishes and stuff like that. Every time they're growing like bacteria on a little petri dish, that's agar. Super common. Also used in cosmetics. Yeah, because again, it's kind of like Jell-O. It's like a plumping agent, and therefore used in a lot of different type of cosmetics. Also used in meat products. If you've ever had like a gross like cube of ham, like you just like put it out of the jar, you go, like there's that kind of little jelly stuff that comes with it. Yeah, that is agar. It is literally jelly. It's used to kind of give it that meat that form. So usually they like grind a meat and they kind of like mince it, and then they just like add it to the Jell-O and they kind of like pack it into that form. I know, weird stuff, but it's just algae. It's not bad for you. It's agar. It's actually pretty good for you. Here's how we collect it. This is actually a boat. Hopefully you can see this picture. Also, it's in your PowerPoint. This is a boat. It basically has this little wheel that turns, and they go out in the ocean just looking for algae. Okay, so they actually pull it up here. It comes up here, and then this conveyor belt takes it up on the inside and then dumps it into this cargo container right here. Or you can do it the old-fashioned way. You can grow it and farm it like these guys are doing here, and they're actually laying it out with these planks so that they can lay it out, organize it, and then harvest it. Super interesting. Here's the different types of algae that we're going to be focusing on. So there are 3 that we're going to be focusing on there. Now, there are more groups, but we're going to simplify it down to the 3. The red, the greens, and the browns. The rhodophyta, green, the chlorophyta, and brown, the phaeophyta. So yes, you will need to know those names, and we're going to go over them in just a second. But this is a really amazing chart to kind of help you guys study off of. So definitely take a look at this one here. Now, at the very bottom, it doesn't say algae. It says flowering plants. Plants, yes, actual plants. There are a couple plants that can survive in the ocean with that salty, salty water and not get dehydrated. So we're going to learn about those plants at the end of this lecture. So let's talk about the green algae. So this is the division Chlorophyta. Remember, this is the ancestor of land plants, of true plants, of all true plants, not just land plants. They are microscopic, meaning tiny, 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 or macroscopic, meaning actually pretty big. We have some common ones off of our coast, like ulva is a very common one. It's called sea lettuce. It literally looks like kind of like romaine lettuce. They're weird round ball ones, and there's green fluffy ones, and all sorts of different green algae. Now, I don't want you to just strictly go by color. Now, if we were actually in lab, I would have you guys go through these and I would test you and trick you, because there are green algae that appear brown. There are red algae that appear green. Everything's just, so don't go by color. Obviously, I'm not trying to trick you, so if you kind of go by color, it's not the end of the world. But I do want you to go by characteristics. Now, because these are the ancestor of land plants, they are, most similar to land plants. So think about those like green leafy, I don't want to say that because I don't want to confuse you. We're just going to go on. Okay. So they do have chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. This is basically just color extracting pigments that are found inside their chloroplast. They're really good at doing photosynthesis. So when they have extra sugars, they essentially store them as starch. This is super common in plants as well. And again, ancestor of land plants, so it makes sense that these guys do that. They do have cellulose in their cell walls, or cellulose cell walls. Essentially, again, this is just a complex sugar, a complex carbohydrate that's turned into a structural usage, which is really nice. And again, you do have some of the leafy kinds here. You do have some of the fuzzy, almost mold kind of looking types. But again, all just green algae. The brown algae are next. These are the division Phaeophyta. These guys are microscopic to macroscopic. That's pretty much all of the algae. But these guys do like it shallow and they do like it colder. They do not like hot waters. So if the temperature gets too hot, and a lot of times off our California coast it does, especially during El Nino years where the water's really warm, people love it. Algae hates it. Specifically the brown algae really don't like it. These is where you're going to actually have your Pneumatocyst. Remember, the brown algae has your Pneumatocyst. And this, again, is going to be that Macrocystus that we talked about, that giant kelp that lives off our coast. It is so very, very important. This is the source of algin, which we already talked about. This is chlorophyll A and chlorophyll C, slightly different than the green algae. Also has fucoxanthin. What else? They do like it the temperate waters. Remember, temperate means a little bit cooler. So it's not the tropics and it's not the polar. So it's not freezing, but it's not boiling, right? It's temperate. It's kind of right in the middle. Warmer during the summer, colder during the winter kind of thing. These guys, again, like the kelp, provide so much habitat. It's really, really important to keep these things around because the complexity of these kelp forests allow for so many different organisms to live there and therefore a really healthy ecosystem. So the giant kelp, again, is going to be one of these brown algae and super, super important. Mammals eat them, birds eat them, birds live on them, birds eat the things that are in them, mammals eat the things that are in them, fish live near them and around them. Some fish live in them, like the giant kelp, the island kelpfish, and the giant kelpfish. There it is. The island kelpfish is the little one. The giant kelpfish is the one that literally looks like a blade. It literally turns its face down, tail up, and then kind of moves with the waves as they go back and forth, moving the kelp. It's crazy. So lots of organisms depend on these. It's very, very crucial to have. If you've never been under a kelp, let me see if I can move this light for a second. There it goes. I want you guys to see this because it's beautiful. It is stunning. This is the sunlight radiating through. You've got the fishes that are hiding up here in the canopy. You've got more fishes that are hiding near the stalks. Fishes that are pretending to be blades. You've got fishes that are living down here. It's just it's gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. And it looks like a forest, hence Kelp Forest. Because it really does create this 3D ecosystem where if it wasn't there, it would just be barren. It would just be pile of rocks. Maybe a couple fish, probably not. Because during El Nino years, when these populations drop, the kelp forests get basically wiped out. There's nothing there. You go to Catalina and you go snorkeling, it goes from this gorgeous, gorgeous picture to nothing. And that's not the only reason that we lose our kelp forests, but we're going to learn about that later on in the semester. Here's the bottom of the kelp forest. So we can see many different fishes. We have some rockfishes, we have some perch, we have a California sheephead, we have a Garibaldi. These are just the fishes that are living right near the bottom. We've got urchins, we've got sea stars, we've got encrusting algae, we've got all sorts of snails and worms and all sorts of incredible diversity going on in and around this kelp forest. So this brown algae is super, super important to especially our California communities. Now, that's not the only ecosystem that is created based on one single type of brown algae. Sargassum is another one. In fact, there's something called the Sargasso Sea, which is literally a floating pile of algae. And you're like, well, how can that be an ecosystem? Well, it creates essentially an island. So again, you have organisms that can live on the top, you have organisms that can live in the middle, you have organisms that can live underneath, you can have organisms that will just float right underneath and use this as protection. You'll have some organisms like birds who will come and sit on top of it. It's crazy how much these ecosystems rely on simple structure. So the Sargasso Sea is right here. We are in the Atlantic Ocean, the northern Atlantic. And essentially what we're looking at is this is the North Atlantic Gyre. Okay, so the North Atlantic Gyre, I had that right. The North Atlantic Gyre, right? It's going in this clockwise motion because we are above the equator, right? And what happens is right in the middle is you kind of just have this like little rotating, this little tiny just circle of water that just doesn't really go anywhere. Okay, and so since nothing really goes anywhere, any sargassum that's out there floating around eventually will kind of work its way right here to the Sargasso Sea, creating this huge mat of sargassum that is its own little ecosystem, its own little habitat, which is absolutely crazy. Tons of different species can be found there. It's really, really cool. And this is what it looks like. In fact, every time I go to Florida, we actually fish along these. So what you do is you take your boat and you drive along and you follow this with lines like being towed behind you. And fishes, smaller fishes are going to hide under here because, you know, there's going to be invertebrates, which is going to be food for the smaller fishes, which is going to be food for the bigger fishes, which are hanging out down below. And that's what you do. You cruise by with a little, you know, lure behind your boat. And these larger fishes that are hanging out looking for smaller fishes, boom, jump up and attack it, and now you have a fish. Birds will also follow these trails looking for, again, these invertebrates, small fishes, stuff like that. Really just super, super diverse. And this is all just floating sargassum. It's not attached to anything, but it does the trick. All right, moving on to our last of the algae. This is our red algae. This is the last of our algae groups that we're going to be talking about. This is the division Rhodophyta. There are a lot of these guys, and they do actually like it a little bit deeper. So we talked about the brown algae like a little bit shallower. Again, they grow really fast. They need to do photosynthesis a lot, and therefore they need to be kind of shallow. These guys are red, and therefore they're good at absorbing those specific types of light that actually penetrate pretty deep, and therefore can live a lot deeper than the greens or the browns. Now these guys are also sometimes known as coralline, and so that's kind of like coral-like or harder in structure. So if you ever have something that is articulated, I'm gonna get to there. I have a picture of it. I was gonna draw it, but I have a picture of it. Then you know it's a red algae. Anything that's harder, a little bit more girthy, a little more hard to break kind of thing, hard to, almost encrusting or rock-like, that's probably gonna be your red algae. That's pretty characteristics. We got the leafy green, we got the browns with the Pneumatocyst, but the reds are kind of like usually a little more girthy. Let's see, these guys do have chlorophyll A, they have phycolobins, phycobilins, they like it deeper. Here's what they look like. Here's what I mean by articulated. It's this picture right here. This is articulation. It almost looks like segments. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Lots of these little articulating segments, and that's how you know for sure that it's going to be a red algae. Do sometimes kind of have a more leafy structure, but again, a lot of this thicker, heavy-duty, girthier algae for sure is going to probably be your red algae. Now, notice the colors. This one, yeah, super red. These two, kind of red. That kind of looks like black almost. Okay, so don't just go by color. Make sure that you're looking for some of these characteristics as well. All right, that was our algae. So let's talk about our plant friends because they are still important as well. So we're going to be talking about the division Anthophyta, right? This is not Phaeophyta, this is Anthophyta. These are our angiosperms. Okay, angiosperms, again, are flowering plants. So if it's a flowering plant, it is a plant. And yes, a lot of these guys do actually flower, like the seagrasses that we're going to talk about, do make little tiny baby flowers. Super cute. We don't have a ton of Anthophytas in the marine world because salt is a pain. Salt is a bad thing and it dehydrates. So there's really only a couple that we're going to be talking about specifically. So yes, I do want you to know them specifically because there's really only 3 that we're going to be talking about. Because it's a harsh environment to live in the marine environment, especially when you're, an actual true plant. So they do have some of these different mechanisms for dealing with this increase in salinity. Now, seagrasses is one of the big groups, okay? There are lots of different types of seagrasses that live in the ocean. And seagrasses essentially look just like that. They look like grass. Usually a little bit longer than just, your normal lawn, but yeah, seagrasses. Now, seagrasses are amazing communities because they can be found a lot of times near estuaries, which are really great nursery areas. So seagrass beds provide nursery habitats for lots of developing organisms. Invertebrates and vertebrates are all growing up their little babies hiding amongst this seagrass. Eelgrass, I think, being the most common off of our coast. Now, this eelgrass is, again, found in these bays and estuaries, shallow waters, but it does need sunlight. So the clarity of the water actually has to be pretty good. So a lot of estuaries are kind of muddy and murky. You won't find seagrasses if it is muddy or murky. You will only find them if the water's actually clear enough because they need to do photosynthesis. And they're short. They're not going to grow like these big brown algae. They're pretty short, and therefore, if they're too deep, it's not going to work. If it's too murky, it's not going to work. They do grow pretty quickly. That's a good thing because lots of organisms also like to graze on them, like manatees. Manatees, the big old sea cows, yeah, they just survive on grass like actual cows. And therefore, if you just got eaten by a manatee, of course, they're not going to eat the roots, right? They're just going to eat the blades so that the thing can grow back and they can have a food source later in life. Something we need to learn how to do. Just take a little bit now so we have some for later. What? Concept. So again, that's grazing. That's that whole grazing process. So they do grow pretty quick after they have been grazed. Let's see. They do have sperm. Weird. It's pollen. And they also have seeds, which are usually the eggs. So again, these are sexual reproducing organisms, just like the flowers and stuff that you guys learned about in regular biology. Now here's what they look like. Again, very shallow roots. So these do have true roots, not holdfast, actual roots, but they're all really shallow. I mean, like any grass, they're not, it doesn't penetrate too deep. And they look just like that. They look like grasses. I know, weird. Here's an actual picture of some eelgrass. This is exposed during a low tide during intertidal zones. So if you actually go tide pooling and stuff like that, you can see this eelgrass lower down, basically only uncovered during the lowest of the low tides, but you can absolutely see them, and they're kind of going back and forth just like that, right? With the waves and stuff like that. All right. Oh, salt marshes. Salt marshes are our next one. Salt marshes are salty marshes. Weird. This is usually the area where, again, you have some kind of river runoff meeting the ocean. So it's almost like these estuaries. But usually what ends up happening is you have some kind of smaller, almost like pond or little lagoon, and then you have the salty marshes on the outside. Now, because this is an area that is subject to flooding via high tides, big storms, stuff like that, they do have to deal with, again, this intense salinity, and therefore you have to be able to deal with that excess salt in the salt marsh. And so a lot of the times you don't get a ton of diversity when it comes to the type of plants that can live in these salt marshes because it's really harsh areas. Spartina is a classic one that you can find in almost any salt marsh here in California. Again, really only exposed to salt water during the highest of high tides. So unlike these grasses, which are always covered and only rarely exposed, these guys are almost never covered by that covered by the seawater. So this is only if the area does flood via storms and stuff like that. So yes, they're living in the surrounding areas. Yes, the soil is very, very salty, but these guys are not usually submerged. These are kind of like the reeds and the spartina that you can find on the outside of the marshes, like if you're walking around the estuaries, not the ones that are going to be found actually inside the water. These guys do have a salt gland. This is something that we're going to see a couple different organisms throughout the semester have a salt gland. Essentially, it's a gland for removing the salt, keeping the water but removing the salt. So very useful to have. Because again, these are going to be salty areas. The only water that's available to you might be a little bit of fresh water, but probably a lot of salt water in that soil, and therefore you want to pull out the water that you can and leave the salt behind with the salt gland. Again, another important nursery area, just like any of these estuaries, really, really important nursery areas. Same thing with salt marshes. Not a lot of organisms can survive in such a salty area, and therefore, if you can, it makes a great nursery area for you to grow up without the threat of predators. Here's what that looks like. Again, you can kind of see that fresh water meeting the seawater, sometimes subject to flooding. But again, this is going to be the salt marshes over here. So this could be the salt water, but this is going to be the salt marshes living up and out of the actual water. Mangroves have a special place in my heart because if you go to Florida, you will see a ton of mangroves. Mangroves grow everywhere. These guys kind of do like the salt marshes. They're living adjacent to the salt water, but not really living in salt water. The only difference is their root system. So these basically have long root extensions to kind of prop them up out of the water. So their roots are in the salt water, completely submerged in salt water. But the body really of the plant is again going to be above the water, especially the leaves and stuff like that. Those cannot be in the salt water. In fact, usually what you see in Florida is you'll see them kind of grow up to a point, and that's actually the high tide mark. So the high tide and will go up and down and up and down, and you can actually see, oh, if you can see a lot of the roots, you know it's low tide. If you can't see any of the roots, you know it's high tide. It's kind of crazy and a pretty cool natural way to tell what the tide is. There is, we talked about the prop roots, again, propping them up out of the water. These guys do not do good in cold temperatures, I can tell you that. So anytime a big winter storm comes in, like every once in a while Florida gets really cold, and you'll actually see iguanas like fall out of the trees because they get frozen, their muscles get, and then they just like literally start falling out of the trees. It's actually, once they warm up in the sun, they're fine, then they run away. But mangroves, again, do not like it too cold. So if there's a really cold year, you'll see a lot of mangrove die off. Also during hurricanes. The last hurricane, major one to go through was Irma. I mean, knock on wood, it is hurricane season right now, so who knows what's going on. Or at least when I recorded this video the first time. So again, Irma totally wiped out a huge percentage of the mangrove population because they had all that salt water blowing up onto the leaves. So normally, right, the roots are submerged and that's okay, but once you get the whole thing submerged, those increased levels of seawater, just the wind blowing that constant seawater on you, all can do really nasty things. So there's a lot of die-off, but luckily, if any part of that plant is alive, they can come back and regrow. And this is what you can see right here. So this is low tide. Normally high tide, the water would be all the way up here, but this is low tide right here, and you can see all these little prop roots which are sticking out here in the water, and actually in the water create a lot of habitat. Again, you essentially have these long finger-like things hanging down, so little fishes will actually swim in between them, avoiding the predators. The predators will cruise the canals, but the little fishes are all hiding inside, almost like a cage. It's actually pretty cool. I think it's all pretty cool. I mean, that's why I'm teaching the class, because I love it. All right, so let's keep talking about reproduction when it comes to these guys. These guys, again, are going to do that sexual reproduction. They're going to produce seeds, they're going to produce pollen, they're going to produce all this kind of stuff. But these guys do it in kind of like specialized little packets. These are called seed pods. And essentially what they do is they germinate themselves and then they drop it once it's germinated, meaning once it's ready to go and fertilized and all that kind of stuff. And the seed is not fertilized, but germinated, and ready to go, it will literally fall off and drop into the water and then float away. And when it lands, boom, it's ready to grow. And so, again, this is really important because, again, if you're going to do sexual reproduction, you don't want to reproduce with an offspring of yours who is your DNA. You want, again, always someone else's DNA. But if you drop all your seeds straight down, who's the only person around you to reproduce with? So again, you want your seed pods to drop into the water and then float away, and then they grow up somewhere else, far away from you, and they can reproduce sexually with whoever they want to, and so can you, and they won't be your kids. Yeah, it's weird. I mean, they're plants. Does anybody really care? No, but still, genetic-wise, DNA-wise, yeah, you do still want new DNA coming in. You always want that new DNA coming in. All right, and this is exactly what these little seed pods are right here. You can see them hanging down as such. I don't know what happened to my lighting, but we just went crazy. But good thing, we're done. Oh my God, another amazing lecture. Thank you guys so much for joining me as always. Yes, stay off the seaweed, kids. It rots your brains. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your week, and I will see you guys very soon for our next lecture, because we are going to start on animals now. We are done with the bacteria. We're done with the protists. We're done with the plants and the algae. We're going to be talking about animals, so it's going to get really cool. Our next lecture is on porifera, the phylum porifera, or sponges. And you're like, why are sponges so cool? Just wait, because they're totally cool. And you're going to find out in our next lecture. Thank you guys so much for joining me again. Have a wonderful week.